back there. Is the TV still viewable for you guys in the back room, or is that too much of an angle? You guys can still see what's going on the TV. Audio still coming through okay? Everybody's beds was clean. The tables were clean when you got here this morning. Good night's sleep. Good breakfast this morning. If you travel enough, a breakfast at a Holiday Inn or a Best Western is the same all across the United States. You get the same biscuits, the same gravy, the same dehydrated eggs. It's wonderful. You know what to expect. You just make a decision that morning whether you're going to have it or you're going to go a different direction. It's 9 o'clock. Our fearless leader is not here, which means he stayed and had a good time last night, apparently. So I'm going to go ahead and get started this morning. A couple of items, again, of discussion. We've got our raffle, as we did last night, happening again today. See James Sprague if you want to go buy any of the tickets for the ELM Trust raffle. Those will be done rapid fire this evening. Last night we gave multiple watches to the same person. We don't like to see that. So make sure that you get your raffle tickets today and get your watches picked out. We got another good day of food, another good day of fun, and another good day of lectures that's going to be happening today. So we hope to keep you all engaged, entertained, awake, fed, caffeinated, and then alcoholed up tonight, whatever it needs to be, okay? Without further ado, I'm going to introduce Mr. Philip Stoller. Mr. Stoller is currently the instructor at Gym City over at Quincy, Illinois. So if you've been to that school, he's actually made huge strides in it. He is also, much to my happy pleasure, love to see it happening again, the REC chair for AWCI again. So that's absolutely wonderful that there's been a revival with that organization right now as well, and I owe that to Stan and to Phil to be able to bring this back into place. It's something near and dear to my heart as a former educator, to be able to see like-minded individuals be able to sit around a table and talk about things that affects them all, and Mr. Stoller's done that. He is obviously no stranger here to AWCI. For those of you who don't know, he actually attended school here. At one time, AWCI was a full watchmaking school, and he was one of the students that went through when Mr. Lubick was teaching that program in that class, and it's been an opportunity for him to learn and grow and do all kinds of fun things after that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over now to Philip for his presentation on using natural stones in watches and clocks, and I'm sure it's going to be an awesome presentation.
Okay. Good day to you all. I appreciate the way the show was started last night and can in many ways connect to a lot of what Runa shared with us, and especially about the part where the satisfaction that comes from the realization that you can make just about anything, or that you look at something and you think, I can make that. And that's how kind of this journey started with me, is not that I thought that I could, but I was willing to try, I guess, when I got a couple customer jobs in. I want to start with the premise of the talk, and it's somewhat implicit in the title of the talk, the use of natural jewels in antique watches, that my talk is going to be primarily from the perspective of restoration work. We all come to a show like this from our unique place within the field of horology, and some are clockmakers, some are watchmakers, some work on more modern pieces and some on more antique pieces. And so this is strictly from the perspective of restoration and restoring old pocket watches in particular. And yeah, we're gonna start a little bit with the history of this, and I'm just going to take you on the journey that I personally have taken through this over the last, let's say, 7 to 10 years, when it started with a couple customer jobs that came in, and I thought, well, this would be interesting to learn, interesting to know. And so we're going to start with the history and some of the research that I've done before we get into the actual making of it, and start with a kind of a time period that we're looking at. The first reference, when I started researching literature and books on what does it say about jeweling in watches and jeweling in horology in general, the first reference that I was able to find was referenced by Christian Huygens in 1673 in his writing on the pendulum clock, and in there he is referencing the use of a diamond as, if you understand the wordage a little bit, it's a different, obviously it's been translated, but it's worded kind of awkwardly compared to the way we speak today. But what he is describing is essentially a cap jewel on the lower pivot of the old clocks that use the verge escapement. The lower pivot had a lot of friction, so he's talking about the use of, potentially the use of a diamond in the lower cap. And to my knowledge, this is the first reference of the use of any sort of gemstone in the field of horology. Now my forte, my wheelhouse is not early clocks like this, so I don't know, and there's other people that can speak to this, I don't know how often, how frequently they actually see diamond cap jewels in those early clocks. But the thing that I'm going to be focusing on most is going to be the references to hole jewels or using jewels as jewel bearings as opposed to the more common brass bearings that we find in older watches and clocks. And the person credited to introducing watch jewel bearings is Nicholas Fascio. There's a couple ways that his last name is spelled. Sometimes it's spelled with a T instead of a C, but regardless, there is some debate on whether it was 1723 or 1704. Britain's book on old clockmakers and old watchmakers presented the best evidence by actually producing the patent number. He actually applied for a patent and applied for the rights to use this technology exclusively. And the story is told in multiple sources that when he applied for the patent, the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in Britain went to the patent judge and produced a watch and said, here's an older watch where there's a jewel in it. So no, he isn't the first person to use a jewel in a watch. And so his patent was actually denied. And what they found is over 140 years later, when that particular watch that was presented as evidence was actually inspected, because it was still in the special collections of the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers, that the jewel that was in there was simply a non-functional jewel. It was just put in there as decoration. And they did this purposely because they didn't want to give Nicholas the exclusive rights to use his technology. And so what we find is almost immediately, we start seeing pocket watches that have jewels in them made by other makers and not by Nicholas or his partner. If you're familiar with early verge fusee pocket watches, you know that initially the balance pivots were not jeweled. The pivots were held in blind holes or half drilled holes just in brass plugs. And so it's reasonable to understand that the first jewels in pocket watches were half drilled jewels. They were not drilled all the way through like we're familiar with today. And so based on an article I read earlier this year, what we find is that the earliest period of jeweled watches, it was just the balance, the verge balance. And there is a period of time roughly between 1704 when this was made public and 1730 that the jeweled watches, the balance jewels were just half-drilled rubies. If you ever come across an old Verge fusee that has a half-drilled fusee, or half-drilled jewel, and it was almost always a ruby jewel, what you have is a very unique piece from a very specific time in the history of watchmaking. And the picture of this one here is from the history of the Science Museum in Oxford, England. The maker there, Charles Good, was one of the makers that actually stole the idea and started putting them in his own watches. And it's roughly about the time of 1730 that we start seeing the more familiar arrangement to all of us, and that is the completely drilled hole jewel with a cap jewel, and most often it was a diamond cap jewel. We see that throughout the 1700s, and at this time, this was still very much a closely guarded English secret. It was not outside of England, but we start seeing this arrangement in watches where you have the two jewels instead of the one from 1730 on. And then a little bit later in the history, we start seeing some other innovators. John Harrison, one of the most celebrated horologists in time, came up with his marine chronometers, and his H4 had extensive use of jewels for bearing surfaces in there as well. What his H4 is most known for is that the verge, he had a modified verge balance escapement, and the verge itself had diamond stones, and that's what diamond pallets. And if I'm not mistaken, this is the first time we see stone pallets in a watch. George Daniels was an expert on Breguet, and he puts forth a couple ideas that I can't argue with. I think they're well grounded, certainly within his experience. But he claims to have personally serviced a couple watches that dated between 1775 and 1787. A couple of Breguet watches that had English-made jewels in them. And he theorized that Breguet possibly was the first person to export jewels from England to another country. And of course, it wasn't long after that that Breguet himself started producing jewels within his own workshop, and you started seeing jewels in his own watches that were not English-made later on. And then in the early 1700s, or late 1700s, the 1790s, when he was in exile during the French Revolution, this is when he came up with the ruby cylinder. So he was skilled enough at working stone material that he was making the ruby cylinder escapement. And if you look at that and examine that, that is an absolute wonder to think that at that time period he was producing something like that. You can note on the escape whale bridge that is also jeweled at this time. Some earlier versions of that, it was still a brass bushing there. And then we come into the early 1800s, and this time period is really kind of my wheelhouse. It's my favorite vintage of watch, say the late 1700s, early 1800s to work on. A couple of years ago, I told Jason Champion that I'd rather work on one of these old fusees than any of this modern stuff, and he thought I was crazy, and probably still does. But this is kind of my fascination right here, and this is what really got me started. One of the things that got me started interested in the whole concept of jeweling. Now, if your own perception of watch jeweling is the modern watches and the modern ruby or sapphire jewels, you will look at these watches here and you'll look at the one on the left and you'll say, oh, clear jewels, those must be sapphire. Or, oh, the one on the right, red jewels, those must be ruby. To which I would respond, not so quick. We will learn in a little bit here further on in the presentation that English watchmakers especially, they used all kinds of different gemstones in their jeweling. So those are not necessarily sapphire and ruby there. This is for me a fun time period, but at this point, the Swiss are also starting to make and produce jewels. So you'll see in even the simple Swiss bar movements that nobody likes to work on, you'll start to see them being jeweled up as well. And we'll talk a little bit about the Swiss industry as well. We get a little bit further into the 1800s and then we start seeing the American industry start producing watches. But it's interesting to note, if you look at the early American jewels, they look strikingly similar to the English, big, showy English Liverpool fusee windows. The previous page, the watches there with the big showy jewels were called Liverpool fusees. And these jewels are also big and showy and very clear. And the reason why those look so similar is because in the earliest American industry, the American industry had not yet tooled up to make their own jewels, so they were actually purchasing their jewels from England. These were English-made jewels. The material and the look were very similar. Now, throughout the in the latter part of the 1800s, they had learned and discovered that you could take crushed ruby or crushed sapphire and melt it and fuse it together and create a kind of new synthetic or fused stone. But in that time period, the stone, if you will, synthetic stone was very coarse and rough and was not considered superior to natural stone. But it was somewhere either 1902 or 1903 that a man by the name of Verneuil came up, and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that name, came up with the method of flame fusion, where he took alumina oxide, which is the base mineral for sapphire, and he was able to, in a special furnace, he was able to create boules or large pieces of synthetic ruby or synthetic sapphire. And this begins the time period where synthetic stone started being created. 1910, by 1910, he had over 30 furnaces in operation. And so we begin in 1910, really the time where we start phasing out natural stone and phasing in synthetic stone. And like so many things in the history of humanity, World War II changed so much. And I found this notice that was I found quite interesting. This was from 1943, and if you read through this, it says, whereas national defense requirements have created a shortage of jewel bearings for the combined needs of defense and private account, and the supply of jewel bearings is now and will be insufficient for the defense of essential civilian requirements. In the latter part, he says, now therefore it is ordered that each supplier set aside his entire stock, receipts, and production of finished jeweled bearings and jewel bearing material other than natural sapphire or natural ruby. And when it says that, it tells me three things, okay? That in 1943, they were still using natural stone, okay, even though synthetic stone was coming in. It tells me that even though they have used all different kinds of stones in the past, they have now reduced it down to just using ruby and sapphire. And it tells me by this time period in history, because natural ruby and natural sapphire were exempted from the conservation effort, it tells me that they considered synthetic now to be superior, okay? And so The time period that we're going to be looking at for the restoration work that we're going to be looking for natural stones and trying to identify them is essentially 1704 to 1943, because pretty much everything after World War II is going to be synthetic ruby. And so moving forward, I just posed 3 questions that I hope to address to you in the further part of this presentation, and that is, what gemstones did they actually use? If they used all different kinds, how do we as bench practitioners identify them, properly identify them? Or how can we make an educated guess? And what is it that I have here? And then how were they formed, both historically, but how do we do it in our own personal practice today? And we'll go through it. This that I'm presenting is kind of in the order of my own personal discovery and my own personal experimentation. So I'm going to take you through a lot of literature and documents and articles that I have found, and I focused on trying to find the oldest literature I could from the time period that they were actually using natural stones in watches. Not more of a glance back, but more of a, this is what we're using today situation. One of the first books that I received from a client and a friend of mine was Jewel Bearings and Watches by Charles Higginbotham. This is from 1910. So this would have been right at the front end of the synthetic stones, and they would still have been using natural stones. And he says, there are practically 4 kinds of jewels used in watches today, namely diamonds, sapphires, rubies, and garnets, although aquamarine and chrysolite have been and are now to some extent used. How many of you knew that garnet was used as watch jewels? Okay, there's a few. How many of you knew that they use aquamarine as watch jewels? 1. Is there anybody in here that knows what chrysolite is? 1 person, 2 people. Okay, very good. When I found this article, I didn't have a clue. I was amused, amazed, interested when I found out that aquamarine was used. I had known that there was garnet, and it's not hard to find garnet still today. This is an assortment from school. And if you look at that list, half the list are garnet, okay? I personally have seen an official Elgin catalog of jewels, an assortment of jewels, and half the assortment of replacement jewels for their watches were garnet. And we'll discuss those further. The next book I was able to come across was Watch and Chronometer Jeweling by Sherwood. And he confirms everything that the previous one said, confirming sapphire, ruby, chrysolite, and aquamarine. Garnet in English watches plays an important part for pellets and also roller pins or roller jewels. He had nothing complimentary to say about garnet, and I suspect that the garnet of his day, or the ones that he was exposed to, was a very coarse or porous garnet that actually worked more as an abrasive than it did as a better bearing surface. But he confirms the ones previously noted. And most of us are familiar with, or a lot of us are familiar with Claudia, Saunier, Claudia Saunier. Most of us are familiar with his treatise on modern horology, but and he likewise in his writings on the Watchmaker's Handbook, he confirms all the things that we've had listed so far. So diamond, ruby, sapphire, garnet, chrysolite, aquamarine. He confirms those things. But what I find most interesting is he also mentions other stones not to use. And the way my thought process is, why would he mention those? Is it because they actually tried them and found them unsuccessful and then Does that mean that there are potentially watches out there that have these stones in them? Why does he mention them? But he mentions spinel in that first paragraph. The second paragraph, he mentions the false ruby, which we'll come to find out later that ruby was a name, just a general name given to any stone that had a red color to it. And so he mentions here rubicella or rubace or rock ruby, Brazilian, Siberian, Bohemian ruby, rose ruby. These, if you do the research, like the first paragraph mentions spinel and balas rubies. Balas rubies is another name for a different color of spinel. Same way with rubicella and rubace is a form of another name for the mineral group of spinel. Rock ruby and rose ruby, I suspect, are actually referencing a quartz with a red color to it. Bohemian ruby is actually in reference to a red glass. I was not able to find anything about Brazilian or Siberian ruby other than their birds. But the thing that I would put out there to any of you is that in his treatise on modern horology, he only has this line in there. And he says, our treatise on jewels, published separately, enters into full details on this subject. In my research, I have not been able to find this document. And I just put out there for all of you that if you know where there is a reference to this separately published treatise on jewels, I don't know that I'm going to learn anything new from it, but I would like to have a copy of that to add to my collection for research. So if any of you have reference to that, please let me know. And then Saunier references a much older writing by Dumontier, a Frenchman, and this is from 1841. And in my research up to this point, this was the oldest document that I was able to find concerning jeweling, and it's the art of working precious stones for the use of watchmaking and optics. And I got a digital version of this in French and had a student who was fluent enough in French to be able to translate it for me. He volunteered to do this. Here again, it confirms the things that we've learned so far, that working rubies, sapphires, and chrysolites, must first recommend the study of these stones with greatest attention. But he mentions here that if you're going to use ruby, you only want to use the oriental ruby. And the footnote says the name ruby was applied to various bodies of red color, some species of a corundum. Corundum is the mineral group that the real rubies and sapphires belong to. Others of spinel and others of topaz. And here again, the way my mind works is, well, did they possibly try using spinel? Did they possibly try using topaz? Is there a watch out there that potentially has this? And the reason why they recommend only the corundum ruby is because they've done experimentation earlier. This is the thing that I like about this time in history is there's a lot of experimentation going on in the field of horology. So who knows what we'll find. Eventually I stumbled upon this article, and this is easily one of my favorite articles that I came across, and it's by Alvin Kleeb, written for Gems and Gemology, which, if you're not aware, that is the official publication of the Gemological Institute of America. And this man took the very unique perspective of a gemologist looking at old watches and their jewels. And he was able to positively identify what is it that's in this watch. And I found it fascinating because he could, with more authority than you or I, or more authority even, identify what is the archaic stones that, we don't use the term ballast rubies anymore. We don't use the term chrysolite. What is the modern terminology in here? And he wrote, and I'm going to show several pages of his article that he wrote. It's the spring. If I was able to download it from the GIA website, and I don't know if it's still up there, but if you want this article, at one time you could download the PDF of this article, and it's a fascinating read from my perspective. He says, I found that I was dealing with quartz, just plain rock crystal. Further tests revealed more watches with quartz jewels. This made it apparent that Old English jewel makers were not particular about what they used. Perhaps they used any stone they were able to procure. If so, all stones harder than quartz were possibilities, and perhaps even some softer stones could have been used. And I want you to remember this note because we're going to have this proven over and over again to us that perhaps the Old English jewel makers were not particular about what they used. We're going to find that out in a real way. A watch made by Joseph Johnson of Liverpool contained beryl, chrysoberyl, sapphire, garnet, and diamond. That's 5 different gemstones in one watch. Okay? And I went to my drawer full of watches and pulled out a Joseph Johnson and took off the balance and balance bridge so you could see them easily. But if you look, the one up at the 9 o'clock, that's a clear jewel. The ones at the top are kind of pink. The one over there is a different color of red. And so it's very potential that right here I have 3 different kinds of stones within one watch. Now I want to talk about the 5 different stones that he finds in that watch. Beryl is a family of minerals. It's a family of stones. And if the beryl is clear, we call that goshenite. If it has a light blue color, we call that aquamarine. If it's green, we call it emerald. If it's pinkish or red, we call it morganite. Those are all different names of different gemstones, but they're all within the same family of beryl. And so Alvin, in his article, he contends that most of what he saw was not aquamarine, but actually goshenite, the clear version of it. What I've found from working stones myself, that if you take a light blue aquamarine and slice it thin enough, it will appear clear. So aquamarine, goshenite, it really doesn't matter. The chrysoberyl, Alvin puts forth a very convincing argument that the chrysolite mentioned in the older text is actually a mineral known as chrysoberyl today. I'm guessing just as few people have ever heard of chrysoberyl, but has anybody here heard of the gemstone alexandrite? Okay, most everybody. Okay, so alexandrite is the gem version of chrysoberyl. Okay, but if you have a chrysoberyl that has kind of a pukey color or it's pale and it doesn't make for a very showy or flashy gemstone, what do you do with it? You send it over to the watch jewelers and they make watch jewels out of it, okay? So that's where the chrysoberyl comes from. He also notes later on in the article, he mentions the name of a stone called cymophane. I have never heard of that. I looked it up and it's actually cat's eye. So this is a version of chrysoberyl that has what they call chatoyance, a shimmer similar to star sapphire or tiger's eye in quartz, star sapphire in corundum. So it just had a shimmer. He actually found a couple jewels in American watches that he would qualify as cymophane or cat's eye. But again, that is within the family of chrysoberyl. Of course, sapphire is part of the family of corundum, and garnet, we need to understand that garnet is also a family of stones. It is not a singular stone. And Mr. Klebe also he found that primarily within watches, the two types of garnet that were being used was almandine and pyro. Almandine, he says, is kind of a purplish pink color. And so this stone over here, the Fusee jewel, is actually a purplish pink stone. Without testing, I wouldn't know, but potentially that could be a garnet. And then, of course, diamond is diamond. White sapphire is often found in plates and bridges of Swiss and French watches. He notes this. And Higginbotham and the previous author, which I already forgot, but Higginbotham also mentions this, and he says that while the English jewel makers use a whole variety of stones, the French and Swiss jewel makers use exclusively sapphire and ruby. And so one of the identifying things that when you get an old watch like this in, one of the identifying qualities is if you can identify it as a Swiss watch, you can pretty much be guaranteed that if it has clear jewels in it like this watch, it's likely sapphire. It's not going to be the variety of other stones that it could potentially be. But he goes on to say, I did test one English top plate, however, that contained 3 white sapphire jewels and 1 nearly colorless spinel, this is the only reference that I know of to a spinel jewel in a watch. So evidently the English watchmakers didn't get the memo from Saunier that you shouldn't use spinel. He goes on to say red glass was often used, and if you work on old pocket watches, especially old American pocket watches, this one looks very familiar to you. And old glass was often used to fool unsuspecting buyer that he thought he was getting a bargain for a 21 jewel watch. Or these are just cap jewels on top of brass bushings. They're non-functional jewels. And that center wheel jewel is actually a primitive plastic, a red celluloid washer was placed on it. What I found interesting is that he later mentions that the Keller Company out of New York, the jeweler's supply catalog lists polished ruby, polished garnet, unpolished, and common glass hole jewels. So it's quite probable, and I would agree with this, it's quite probable that there are watches out there that have glass jewels in them. It was interesting, after I prepared all this, that earlier this week at school, going through the old literature and stuff, I found the old catalog of the L.H. Keller Company. And sure enough, it mentions garnet, it mentions ruby, it mentions glass. What I found equally interesting is that whenever it mentioned English jewels for Fusee watches, English set in steel, it doesn't say what the material is. Could be anything. Could be anything. And this is how Alvin Kleeb closes his article, and I lament this, and I find it sad because he says, I still have several dozen watches with jewels large enough for testing, so I plan to write a future article after I have been able to conduct and compile the results of a more thorough search. There was never a second article written, which for me is a very sad thing. In the meantime, I would be interested in knowing if any of you gem enthusiasts have found this phase of gemology of sufficient interest to conduct a few tests of your own. If you should happen to find a stone not mentioned or a watch with a yellow, orange, blue, or green jewels in it, I would be pleased to have you write me. He closes out with saying, I may never find those grossular light, tourmaline, topaz, or zircon watch jewels, but I am still looking. And I put this watch up here because I don't know how well you can see it, but it has brilliant, brilliant blue jewels in it. He mentions the possibility of having blue jewels. The interesting thing about this particular watch is that it was made in that time period after synthetic stone was beginning to be manufactured, but before natural stone was phased out. So who knows whether this is, without formal testing whether this is natural stone or whether it's synthetic stone. My theory is it's synthetic because it's too brilliant of a blue to not use in jewelry. Have you been paying attention to all the different stones we've mentioned? Okay. So diamond, ruby, sapphire, chrysoberyl, which is the chrysolite, beryl, aquamarine goshenite, almandine garnet, pyrope garnet, spinel, quartz, glass. All these have been confirmed to be used. Okay. So here's the conundrum we get into as bench practitioners. You get an early jeweled watch in and it has a clear jewel in it. Well, sapphire's clear. Chrysoberyl could be clear. Beryl could be clear. Spinel could be clear. Quartz could be clear. Glass could be clear. What do you have? How do you know what you have? If it has a red jewel that's cracked and you need to replace. Ruby's red. Spinel could be red. Garnet comes in different shades of red. Quartz could be pink. Glass could be red. How do you know what you have? And how do we as bench practitioners, if we're wanting to positively identify what we have, how do we identify that? Enter the Mohs hardness scale. This is for rock hounds and people into gemology and mineralogy and the sorts of that. This one is brought to us by the National Park Service, so it's specifically for those that are out tromping in the woods rock hounding. And this is how you do a field test of a rock that you find to get a rough guesstimate of the hardness of the rock and to help you identify it then. So we find that diamond, corundum, topaz, quartz, those are all on the high end of the scale. So if we apply the Mohs hardness scale to the jewel list that I just showed you, we come up with a list that looks like that. So diamond is 10. It is the hardest natural stone. It will scratch anything. Okay. Ruby and sapphire are both in this corundum family. They're number 9 on the Mohs hardness scale. Chrysoberyl is 8.5. Spinel is 7.5. Beryl family is 7.5. Quartz is 7. Almandine and pyrope garnet is 7. Glass, I put a question mark. And olivine, I put that in, and that wasn't on the previous list because when I first started this journey of discovery, one of the first places that I went to figure out, well, what is chrysolite? You know, and I just had a dictionary next to my chair that I picked up, and I looked at chrysolite, and it said olivine. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'm enough of a rock nerd to know that the peridot, which is a gemstone, is the gem version of olivine. It's a green stone. And I thought, well, that's very interesting because I've never seen a green jewel in a watch. But it says chrysolite is olivine. So I was lamenting to a fellow tradesman that I wish that there was a comparison chart that compared the Mohs hardness scale to the Rockwell scale. And for those that aren't familiar with the Rockwell scale, it is the scale used to measure the hardness of steel. And I wish there was a comparison chart so I knew where the bottom threshold was of minerals or hardness on the Mohs hardness scale, where it could be used for a jewel and what below that couldn't be used for a jewel because it was too soft. And he gave me an extremely simple and answer. He says, well, just do a scratch test. And I happened to, at the time, be going to a rock show. It's an interest of mine. And so I just went around and I picked up pieces to use as samples, and I went back to my shop and I started doing scratch tests. And I found that all of the stones would not be scratched by an arbor, a center wheel arbor from an old pocket watch, which means all of the stones that I tried would have been hard enough to be used as a jewel until I got to peridot. And peridot, I could kind of scratch the stone and the stone could kind of scratch the steel, which reflects back to the Mohs hardness scale that we saw on the previous scale that says a nail, a steel nail, was 6.5 on the Mohs hardness scale. Okay, so olivine, so there's our bottom threshold. Anything mineralogically that's 6.5 or lower is too soft to use as a jewel bearing. And so that became, before I discovered Alvin Kleeb's article and before I discovered a lot of the articles, this is what I was looking at. That anything above that could potentially have been used as a watch jewel. Now, talking about the stones that Alvin Kleeb mentioned over on the side, the possibility of zircon, topaz, tourmaline, that zircon's 7.5, topaz is 8, tourmaline is 7, all hard enough to be used as jewels. He hasn't found them yet. They haven't been discovered yet. Potentially, they could have been used. But grossularite, which is in the garnet family of stones, was 6.5 and therefore too soft to be used as a gemstone or a jewel in a watch. How do you and I, as bench practitioners, figure out, okay, we have a watch with a broken jewel in there. How do we figure out what it is if we want to positively identify it? And it's not too complicated to just make up our own test kit. Okay, and you get yourself a piece of quartz, which is 7, piece of aquamarine, 7.5, piece of topaz, 8, crystal beryl, 8.5, sapphire. How many broken sapphire crystals do you have in your shop, right? That should be easy to come with. My diamond that I use for TEM, the 10 on the scale, it's one of those little diamond chips set in a little lady's wristwatch. Just take it out and put it in a brass rod. We're gonna see that later. So if you get a broken jewel in and you want to do a scratch test, let's say the jewel will scratch quartz, but is scratched by topaz, then we can make the educated guess that what we have is probably an aquamarine, or at least in the beryl family. Okay? But if your stone scratches topaz, but is scratched by sapphire, we can make the educated guess that what we have is probably a chrysoberyl. And we don't have the instrumentation that a gemologist has, right, to positively identify it, but we can make an educated guess. And yes, ma'am. Yes, but with effort, yes, yeah. Yeah, potentially, yes, yes. Yes, thank you. Generally speaking, it will scratch a softer stone much easier than it will scratch itself. Yes, I agree with that. So moving forward as we've kind of got a bench practitioner's simple way of identifying stones. It's not a gemologist's version of identifying stones, but a way that we can make an educated guess on how to identify the old stones. Moving forward, how were the stones made 150, 200 years ago? And how were the jewels made? And moving forward, I'm going to blend both the historical and the methods that I have adapted in my own personal workshop. And we'll go through them together because there was 2 or 3 different methods used. But there were some things, and specifically the methods differentiated based on, or the methods that changed or were different were the methods in drilling the jewel. Okay, the general forming of the jewel was pretty much the same, and there were some other things that were common, whether you were English or Swiss or American, that was very common. And one of the things that was common across the board was how they would grade diamond, because diamond was generally the abrasive used to form the stones. And they have, I don't know that the term is much used today, but there is the term bort, which is an industrial grade diamond. This is the opaque, coarse, not a clear crystalline diamond, but an opaque and a coarse version of diamond that they would use and they would crush as an abrasive. And they had a specialized mortar and pestle that they would use to take bort, and they would crush it to a powder. And when they got a quantity of this diamond powder that they had just crushed, then they would mix it up into a bowl of oil and let it settle out. And after an hour, they would decant, or after a half an hour, they would decant off the top of the oil into another bowl. And the settlings was considered diamond powder number 1. This was the coarsest and heaviest of the diamond powder that had settled out, and it was used for the coarse cutting. But then the second bowl they would let settle out for 60 minutes or a full hour, and they would go through, and after they would decant it off, and they would let it settle out for another 4 hours and another 10 hours and another 24 hours, and each time they would settle out the diamond, and the longer they let it out, by the time you got to bowl number 5, after it had settled out for 24 hours, you had a very fine diamond compound, and that was your number 5 was used to then polish, whereas the number 1 was coarser, you use that to cut. And fortunately, we don't have to go through this process today. We can just order diamond compound, the grit that we want from a lapidary supply house, and we can mix up our own. There's a number of places you could probably get this on Amazon. I'm not sure. I personally use Kingsley North out of Michigan for a lapidary supply house, and you can get these little 5-carat vials of diamond graded in the particular grit that you want, and as coarse and as fine as you want. Kingsley North is an excellent company. I'm not being paid by them or anything, but they're very easy to deal with. You go to their website, they have order a catalog, you punch in your address, and you get a catalog a week later. Very easy to deal with. And there's a lot of things in here in this presentation and in jewel making, that a lot of things in their catalog that we will use moving forward. The second thing that was common across the board that you'll read in the old literature is the mention of a word called skives. And skives is basically, imagine a circular saw blade. It was a very thin sheet of copper, and this is where they would embed in the rim of that copper blade the coarse number 1 diamond that they had just settled out. And this was used for actually cutting up the gemstones into wafers or slivers that would later become the jewels. Fortunately for us today, we have Amazon. And so you can go on Amazon and get fairly inexpensively, you can search gem cutting saw, and it's basically a 4-inch saw blade that the diamond is already embedded in. Very inexpensive. You get a bundle of 12 for like $20, $25 or something like that. And but I came across these old blades. They're leftovers from the Elgin factory when they were making their own jewel components. Higginbotham shows a method where you mount up the skive or the saw blade in your lathe headstock, and you shellac your nugget of gemstone to the end of a stick, and you hold it on the T-rest and you slice up your gemstone that way. I made this picture in the lower left-hand corner. I made up it's more a contraption than a tool, that acted kind of like a chop saw blade, where the weight of the saw sliced the gemstone. I had an aquamarine that I had super glued to a glass pane, and I just sliced through it and then moved it over and sliced it down. I've also tried the method, as the video shows, where I am using the more modern blade in the headstock of my lathe. And off screen you can't see this, but I have the blade running through a wet sponge. You want to keep the blade wet, either with oil or with water. It doesn't matter. But remember, as we work stones, that if you work it dry, the dust and the debris goes somewhere. Okay? Do you want that? We've already confirmed it's harder than steel, right? Do you want that dust resting on your lathe or your motor? So keep it in solution, water or oil, and we'll talk about cleanup later. A lot of the old articles mentioned talking about how to orient the cuts and how to slice the stone and drill the stone. And they had a method that I'm still trying to understand. I'm not going to try to explain. But basically, and maybe a gemologist could explain this better later, but basically stone, this is how my simple mind processes it. Basically a stone has grain to it. And when we slice a stone, we need to slice across the grain, but when we drill the hole in the stone, we need to drill with the grain. So if you imagine like a piece of wood, cross-cut or with the grain. And so you see here a piece of aquamarine. That's kind of the way we need to process it, and those all then, they could be processed into jewels. But that is the way. They had a way of identifying it, because sometimes you'll get a stone that has been tumbled or is frosted and you can't really tell which way the crystalline structure is. They had a way of identifying that. I haven't quite wrapped my mind around it yet, so I'm not going to try to explain it. Now moving forward, there's predominantly two different ways that they would form jewels, and it's basically the English method and the Swiss method. And the English method used a tool like this, and I want you to, I'm going to pause here, and I want you to look at this. This is from Theodor Krom's excellent volumes of books on old watchmaking tools. But I want you to look at this. They made jewels on this lathe by the power of a foot pedal by the light of a window. Okay? You do not need premium equipment. There is no reason why anyone here that would be interested in learning how to make jewels could not make jewels on very humble equipment in your own workshop. If they did it 200 years ago with this, you can do it with equipment that you have today. And I just say that to encourage you. There is a mentality within our field that you have to have premium equipment. And I push back against that very politely. This type of lathe is known as a tapered lathe, or a wax lathe is another term for it. That the hole in the very end of the headstock in here was a tapered, much like the taper in the tailstock that we use today. And they would put in a tapered brass piece, and then whatever they wanted to turn, they would shellac to that brass piece. And so the process that they would use was they would shellac a gemstone up there, and then they would use either a crushed piece of bort, or they would actually have well, let me pause here. This picture comes from an excellent article that I haven't yet referenced, but it's in Antiquarian Horology, December 2014, by Ian Greaves. If any of you have the opportunity to obtain this and read that article, one of the best articles. If you could boil it down to two articles, read Alvin Kleeb's article out of Gem and Gemology and read this article in Antiquarian Horology. This is his picture, and he tells the story in here of the diamond cutters from Holland coming over to England with their offcuts and small pieces that they could no longer use, and actually selling them to the jewel makers of England. And these were the scrap. These were the things at the bottom of the tray. And what the jewel makers would do is they would take a piece, it was a good piece of diamond, but they would take it and they would shellac it into the end of the stick, and they would use it like we would use a graver when we're doing hand turning on a lathe today. And so what they would do is they would shellac a gemstone onto the end of the brass piece. They would round it up, flatten it up, they would form it, create the concave, and then they would take, because sometimes when you crush bort, it would crush in splinters, and instead of shards or rough fractures, it would actually splinter, and so you would have a long pointy piece. So they would take one of those pointy pieces, shellac it into the end of a handle, and they would use that to drill halfway through the stone, okay? And then they would reverse, of course they would, before they would reverse it, they would polish everything up with the finer, go through the polishing compounds up to the number 1 fine diamond compound, polish it, and then they would reverse it, center it up, and then with that splinter of diamond, they would drill through the backside of the stone. Okay, this is the English method of piercing or drilling a jewel. Higginbotham points out the flaw in that, or the potential error in that, is because when eventually you come to polish out the hole, you're using a very, very fine taper pin. And if the two holes don't line up perfectly with one another, then you end up boring out the hole, and it's not perfectly perpendicular to the plane of the jewel, and you have this hole that's sideways, okay? That is the flaw of the English method. Now, it could be done if you get a stout enough taper pin. You could correct that, but that was one of the issues with the English method. Antiquarian horology, December 2014. I got this one. I'm not a subscriber. I should be, but I'm not a subscriber. I actually got it off of eBay. I saw it, and he had a half a dozen, and I said, I want that one. Will you sell me that one? And we made a deal. Okay, there you go. Yeah, if you want to check it out from the library, it might be there as well. Yeah. So then we go on to the Swiss method of drilling a jewel. And the Swiss, as opposed to using bits and shards of diamond, they actually went straight to the diamond compound, and they used the powdered compound. Yeah, we're getting towards the end here. And the way they used it is they actually had a tailstock that revolved in the opposite direction. So you had the headstock going in one direction and the tailstock going in the opposite direction at a much higher speed, and then they would embed the end of the drill with the diamond compound and drill that way through the hole, through the jewel. It worked much faster, and they set up factories for jewel making. The one explanation I read is they were able to make, one jewel maker could make up to 150, 200 jewels a day, which I don't believe, but that's what they claim. Because that's like one jewel every 3 to 4 minutes on a 10-hour workday. I don't believe it. Okay, so the downside of working natural jewels is inclusions. Inclusions are natural cracks, fissures, bubbles, debris held within the crystalline structure of a stone. You can see the one on the left has a little bubble off to the right. It's kind of blurry over there, but there is some debris right next to the hole of the jewel, rendering it useless because that becomes an abrasive and it grinds the pivot. The center one, obviously, there's all kinds of debris. That's in the these are clean jewels. I cleaned them purposely before I took this picture. So those are inclusions within the stone. This one, though it's blurry, you have inclusions around in there, but the hole itself is clean. So that's actually a usable jewel. It's not pretty, but it's usable. Here's another picture. Here's some beautiful cap jewels. How do you think the dial rate would look on that stone right there? Clearly unusable. And I learned this the hard way. I had finally completed a couple jobs, jewel making jobs for customers, and I decided I want to continue practicing this. So I'm going to start making just some of my own jewels. And the first jewel I completed, I was pleased, really pleased with how it turned out until I put it under the microscope. And can you see that? That is not a crack. It's a little line of bubbles. And I perfectly placed that hole right to where I could not polish it out. So you only make that mistake once. And so I developed a process that that isn't laid out in any of the literature, because I had this stone. I'm not going to throw it away and get a more perfect stone. I'm going to try to use what I have. And so I developed a process where I took the wafers of stone and I polished both sides of the stone so I could peer through it. And I could see where the inclusions are, and I could also see where the clean points are. So I would spot the stone to where I thought it was clean enough. Well, let's place a drill the hole right there. And so this is the stone that I mentioned earlier, that I showed earlier, that I had sliced up. And you center it up on your lathe, and now I'm going to be gluing this to a brass tube and using that as the wax chuck, if you will. And when you get a bunch of those done, when I get all of those done, you're ready to go. Now, I'm not trying to impress anybody with my equipment. I use a very simple watchmaker's lathe. And the way that I was able to replicate the Swiss method of having a tailstock that rotated as well as the headstock in the opposite direction is I used an old style pivot polisher, and I modified the end of it and ran it to where it would run the opposite direction as the headstock. And I have it set up here to grind the outside. The next two steps, it doesn't matter which order that you take them in. I personally grind the outside of the stone first and circle up the outside. The next step, I'll actually drill the hole in the stone. In American manufacturing, they would actually drill the hole first, and then string up a bunch of jewels on a very tight wire, and then they would round up the outside to the hole. It really doesn't matter which method that you use. But in the course of grinding this, and then because my wafers weren't perfectly flat, you face off the end. Note here, I would grind off the end. Note the spindle is hinging. This is the benefit of using the pivot polisher. The spindle will hinge backwards and forward, and we're going to use that a little bit later. The next step that I like to do, and this is a personal preference, but I like to spot the center. My students here will tell you that one of the first lathe projects they do is marking the perfect center in a piece of brass. And this gives the drill bit somewhere to go, right? And if you're familiar, whether it be with drilling on a lathe or whether it be other ways, you're familiar with using like a center drill that gets the drill, and then you follow with a normal drill bit, and then you bore out the hole with a reamer or a boring bar. This is essentially the same process that we're going to be using, only it's much smaller and on a gemstone. And here's my diamond in the end of a piece of brass that I'm using to spot that center. And then I've tried a couple different methods of jeweling. My first attempt was I would just take a piece of steel. George Daniels mentions using soft steel. And I would take a piece of steel and carve out basically an elongated pivot out of that. And if it was too small of a drill and carving out, turning out soft steel was too fragile, I would do tempered steel to the diameter of drill bit that I wanted, and then I would just anneal it, right? And then we're going to put a spot of diamond compound on the end of the stone. And note the motion back and forth, back and forth. The reason for that is if you just push into the jewel, eventually the contact between the jewel and the drill will grow dry, and there won't be any diamond compound there. So when you pull it back, you're allowing to re-wet the tip of the drill bit and allow the abrasive, the slurry of diamond compound back into the hole to where you can continue. Essentially what you're doing is grinding your way through it's not drilling like we would a normal drill bit. You're grinding your way through. The American method, when they tooled up and actually began making their own jewels, you can watch a long but interesting video on archives.com of the Elgin search Elgin chronometer jewel making. And the way they would do their drill bits is they would actually have a brass tube or a hollow tube that was filled with shellac that they just centered a piece of wire in there, and that was their drill bit. And so I thought I would try to do that as well. And I really like this method. The drill worked well. It's very easy to replace. You just warm the shellac, pull out the wire, put in new wire. And I'm using piano wire here. I got a bundle of assorted piano wire of different diameters. And in the warming of the shellac, you're annealing the wire so it's in a soft state. So you'll notice here that the jewel is awful thick. In my mind, I'm slicing my gemstone thin enough to make jewels, but by the time I round up the jewel, it turns out to be a pretty thick and chunky jewel. This one here could probably be half to 2/3 the height or thickness that it is and still be a good wafer of jewel to use as a jewel. Now, because I tend to drill thicker material than what I really need, I have almost in every occasion ended up drilling. You're also grinding the drill bit, and it usually ends up tapered. And this will still work as a drill, but you've got to be especially careful to let the diamond do the work, because if you're trying to push that through the gemstone, you'll see what happens. You end up cracking the jewel and rendering everything you've done up to this point worthless. The next step, now this is over on the right-hand side, you're going to see the general shape of the jewel. I'm starting with the way that it's originally mounted. I'm starting with the underside out. And so we're going to start forming the underside, and we have just this slight bevel on the underside. So I'm going to, before I reverse the jewel, I'm going to grind that in. What I'm using here is a diamond file. You can, again, from the lapidary supply house, you can get what they're sold as is diamond top plates. They're basically diamond laps intended for machines similar to the GRS power hone used for sharpening your carbide gravers. I get the top plates and I can cut them up with a jeweler's saw and make any shape or form of lap that I want. And that's what I'm using here. I just sliced it into a thin strip, and I'm using that to shape, and I find that to be the fastest. And then, okay, that's a good question. We're going to talk grits later, okay, a little bit later. We'll go through that. And then I reverse the stone on the tube, and now we're forming the convex, the rounded outside convex. Again, we want to keep it wet with oil so we're not releasing all that powder into the air. I have tried this a number of different methods, making special laps that I could charge with compound. I find using the flat laps and using it as I'm showing here to be the fastest way of forming that particular surface. Now the next surface that we're going to use is the internal surface. Unfortunately, we can't use this way of grinding it to form that. In the old literature and in the article that I mentioned earlier, he mentions that the English, for their final finish and their final lapping, they would use pewter and the finest compound in pewter. So I had an ingot of pewter that I just took out and with a ball burr, jeweler's ball burr, made that concave surface in there and used diamond compound to do the polishing. And then the concave portion of this, okay? So again, we're just looking at using it, for me, I'm just using a piece of brass that is rounded at the end with diamond compound, and we're centering it on that hole, and we're now forming the concave or the oil sink of the stone. At this point, we're just forming. I'll go through the polishing in a little bit. And then a couple different ways of opening up the hole or reaming out polishing out the hole. What was used in the past was just tiny taper pins, copper, brass. For the polishing stage of it, they would use a splinter of quill, the quill from a feather. They would take a splinter of that, charge it with diamond compound, and work it in and out. Just like the tapered drill bit, this is a wonderful way of cracking a jewel. If you push that taper pin just in a little bit too far, ask me how I know. A method, if you've got a hole that's large enough that you can actually make a cylindrical brass pin, and then you can use the hinging effect of the pivot polisher to actually lap the sideways pressure on the inside of the hole. It's much safer, and I prefer to do it this way if at all possible. What I'm likely to do in the future is use the drill bit. You know, after I've drilled through, just make the hole, if I need to open it up a little bit, use the side of the drill bit to open that up.
How are you gauging your size?
That is an excellent question, and I meant to mention that. So what I do for knowing how big I should open the hole, what I'll do before I start is I will make essentially a dummy pivot that's the same size as the pivot that I need to fit it, that needs to fit inside of it, and I'll use that as a feeler gauge. So as I'm working it, I'm testing it with the feeler gauge, and so I know how much larger I need to go. So the jewel that I was working in most of the videos here is, I'm sorry I'm going over, but I'm almost done, I promise you. The jewel that I'm working in most of the videos here is on the left-hand side, and you can see it's not polished yet. So let's talk about the grits real quick. I do most of my work, the working with 9 grit, or 9 micron, which is essentially 1800, 2000 grit, okay? I found that if I use 15 micron or 1200 grit, it is too coarse and it leaves the gemstone frosted, and you have to do a lot of polishing to get that out. 9 micron is coarse enough that it grinds fairly quickly, but it leaves it to where you don't have to do much polishing. And then you just go through the stages from 9 micron to 6 micron, 3 micron, 1 micron, and each time you need a new lap. You don't want to, first you need to, after you have the form and you start the polishing process, you need to thoroughly clean it. And this is why I mount it on a brass tube, is because I can put it in a cleaning solution and the solution will get into the jewel and behind the jewel and thoroughly ultrasonic and clean it. And that way we're not cross-contaminating with the coarser grit with the finer grit. And then I will take it up usually to a 1 micron, which is 14,000 grit, to a final finish.
The last step, and this is another jewel that I've made. Of course, it looks really ugly because there's all kinds of inclusions in there, but the hole is clean, right? And it's for myself and it's for practice, so the inclusions doesn't bother me. But if we think back to the old method of grading diamond, they would regularly get an extra coarse grit of diamond even in the finer polishing compound. And you can see that in the old jewels because they will have swirls in there. It'll be polished, but there'll be this one swirl where an errant grit got in there. Well, when they were polishing the surface at the juncture of the concave and the convex portion, that would cause chips on that ridge there. And that was, of course, unsightly. So what they would do is they would polish a flat portion in there to take those chips out. It was functional, but I would claim that I really like the aesthetic of that jewel as opposed to the previous picture. And they would just put it upside down on either a tin lap or a boxwood piece with the fine polishing compound, and they would polish that flat portion into it. And there we have a completed and finished jewel. These are the two pieces that started my journey. The first one, I was not happy that I had to use a stone that did not match the color, but I was able to match the original profile. I had to make that one 7 times before I got it right. So, and the other one is a sleeve for a duplex escapement, for a platform escapement for a carriage clock. That's what started this journey, started my research, and started my effort to practice and learn this for myself. So I'm sorry I went a little bit long. I will be around all weekend. If you have questions or comments, I would be glad to help you out. So.
So if everybody can give him one more round of applause, please. In addition to Philip, she stepped out right now, and I asked her if I could actually point her out. But we actually have Dr. Venn with us as well, who works with the American Gemological Society, who is an expert in this as well. She made a comment during his presentation. But if you've got any questions about natural stones or getting into the GA or the AGS, she's an absolute expert and was one of the education specialists at the Converge event that they just had last weekend that Mr. Ziegenbein and I were at. But please definitely pick Philip Brain this weekend and get any information that you can on it. I know he and Mr. Franke have done this presentation in the past, and both of them I would consider approaching expert level work on a lot of these stones. It's absolutely amazing to look at. So we're going to get set up now for our next presentation. So I will let Mr. Carignan get set up, and we're going to kind of change a little bit of the digital stuff up here. If you need to use the restroom, things along those lines,